Hi, it's Phil McCauley for Labour Business TV, and I'm delighted to be welcoming Gina Miller as my guest today. Hi, Gina, how are you?
I'm well, even in these troubling times.
Now, how are you? Because you've had quite an experience through the COVID period with yourself, your business, your family. How's it been for you?
The very odd thing is, on a personal level, lockdown, we've been in sort of lockdown for about 3 years because of the political stance I took, the legal stance I took. Our entire lives changed. So we stopped going out, we had security. So in an odd way, lockdown was fairly normal. But what was a liberating element of lockdown was that I had a legitimate reason for being in a disguise, for wearing a cap and glasses and a mask. So in a way, it was liberating for me, whilst at the same time worrying, so physically liberating, but mentally, like all of us, extremely worried about what happens next. And from an economic point of view, you know, the fact that we now have borrowing at 109% of GDP is extraordinary. Nobody could ever predicted this. And so at a time when we need real integrity, but intelligence, I am shocked at the incompetence that we're seeing when it comes to the way the pandemic is being handled. The fact that, you know, we've got a prime minister now who's comparing himself to Roosevelt, which with no understanding that building roads and building physical infrastructure is not what's needed for the future. That actually what we need is technology infrastructure, connectivity. We need green infrastructure. We need, it's as though he's living in a past where his ego won't allow him, and the ego of his advisors won't allow them to see problems that have been there anyway. COVID just amplified them. Because, you know, from my view, in some perspective, from some points of view, they're actually they're reaping what they sowed. The underinvestment in infrastructure, in business, in education, in the health service, the austerity years, they never actually put in enough money into parts of the economy that would make it resilient. Our training programs are so out of date for the technologies of tomorrow. So these are just deep-seated issues. And a few bridges and a few roads are not going to solve where we are. And the idea that we're going to unlock the economy, actually, it's credit that unlocks the frozen wheels of the economy. And this is something they don't seem to have grappled with. You know, to put in short-term credit and put in short-term furloughing is not going to rescue enough businesses and jobs for the future. So I'm very concerned that we have a government who don't understand basic economic principles when it comes to creating sustainable environment for work and for employment. And, you know, we can't carry on like this. So I imagine that with, you know, no deal Brexit on the horizon, which I'm sure we're going to go to, we are in for a really tough time. And we do need to have policies that are going to create resilience in our workforce and our economy. And I don't see that coming from the present government.
Now, Annalise Dodds has become the shadow Chancellor for Labour, highly competent politician. Thinking in the round and from the point of view of how you've just framed it, what kind of advice would you bring to her right now? What should she be thinking about as she starts the massive task of putting together a viable economic policy and platform for the Labour Party?
I think probably three things. The first would be that idea of unlocking credit and making sure that that's what the banks do, and that they are behaving in a way where they're not trying to just sell their own products, try and get people to put in collateral that then will mean that those businesses go on, to make sure they don't do what they did in the last financial crisis. Because if you look at the way some of the banks behaved, you know, they ruined businesses and lives, but in the way they lent money. So credit, you know, you've got to have some very strict rules on how banks are going to operate and have complete transparency and independent views on how they're operating. Secondly, I think that you also have to be very mindful that the FCA is not fit for purpose. And one of the things you've got to look at is how do you have a financial services authority that's going to work in a government that seems to be hell-bent on lowering regulation? How do you protect the consumer? Because in a world where you have many people struggling, there's much more opportunity for scams and financial fraud. So you've got to be a tightening of looking at how people are being financially treated and access to finance, but also the fraud levels, because I can see those going through the roof. So I think fraud prevention has got to be something, and you know, going sky high loans, all those things that creep in when people are suffering has also got to be much better regulated. And it's no point having a, you know, a reactive horse after the barn doors closed type regulation, which is what we've seen. You need some really tough exemplary regulation where, you know, they are actually making example, naming and shaming and putting to jail. In the last financial crisis, nobody went to jail. Nobody was even prosecuted who behaved badly from corporate financial institutions or banks. So we've got to have a very robust regulatory environment to ensure that consumers are protected. And the third thing I'd say is we've got to have more a launch into not just financial, but also finance and education. Because if we're going to have a huge amount of unemployment, we've got to look at how do we retrain people. You know, there's not enough money being put into that. So the whole idea of companies getting involved in that and have joined up thinking between private and public sector when it comes to retraining programs and offering retraining for the millions we're going to see unemployed is something we really do need to think about.
Excellent. Now, what do you think the noises off are presently with the new regime at the Bank of England? How's the city responding? How should it be responding? How are you looking at that in your businesses?
I think the majority of corporations I'm seeing, and this is reflected in the market, are living in an alternative universe when it comes to the biggest thing, which will be Brexit, you know, no deal Brexit coming at the end of this year. You know, for the last 3 or 4 years, the city hasn't spoken up because they have never understood that equivalence is not a given. And the idea that we are going to end up in a place where we could have lower regulations and become a free-for-all, where, you know, we lower money laundering checks because out of necessity, because we don't have access to Europe or we don't have access to the same markets, is some reality they're going to have to wake up to. So they're still sleepwalking. There's so many firms I speak to who are still sleepwalking and thinking it'll just magically turn out all right. They have a fundamental misunderstanding of the ideology that's driving this government. And it is not one based on regulation. It's not one based on customer outcomes. It's based on making sure their friends do well. And so we have, you know, the market has not woken up to the honest what's going to happen in probably 6-8 months' time.
So there's a kind of soft corruption going on at some sort of level, potentially, and that's a risk. What is your sense right now of where the policies need to go for Rishi Sunak? I mean, there he is. He's had this sheen and this gloss put on him, handing out money like he's shaking it from Corbyn's magic money tree. And it's just gone on and on and on and on and on. And now we're in this position. He's clearly going to have to think long and hard about raising taxes, which is going to be very damaging to a lot of people in society. What would your advice be to him as Chancellor if we could get past the edifice of Cummings and his filtering? What would your direct advice be to the Chancellor right now?
I think there's some quick wins. We have to look at the big organizations, companies who don't pay taxes in the UK. I mean, that's just an easy win. If you make profits in the UK, you should be paying a comparative amount of tax. And there is an imbalance there. I would look at also, it's not illegal at the moment, but I think it's immoral, the offshoring of so much investments and savings. And the fact that, you know, non-doms don't pay in the UK. There are lots of easy wins he could do. But also to be much braver, if you want to go back to the New Deal, it's things like not imposing, because you couldn't, but advising companies to look at things like ceilings for bonuses, executive pay, to make sure that money goes back into a business and the business is sustainable, rather than having to be bailed out by the government. So it's about a re-evaluating of assets that businesses hold to ensure that they can actually keep the workforce in place for longer. So it can't just be an endless money tree, as you say, the endless borrowing. Whilst borrowing is cheap, yes, fine, you know, but you have to think about, at the end of the day, who's going to own that debt? And if it turns out that by the back door, we have sold off our country to China, we don't know where this money is coming from, who is going to own the debt in the future? And that's very worrying. So be it, you know, our nuclear stations, to our roads, to our bridges, debt is being bought up by foreign powers. And you have to think about that. So we should be using corporate money in a much better way to be sustaining our own debt rather than allowing it to go offshore.
Now, what's your sense of Keir Starmer coming to power in the Labour Party? What changes are you detecting there? How's he shaping up? What does he need to be thinking about as he builds his platform for a future run at becoming Prime Minister?
I think at the moment is reflected, my view is reflected in the polls. I mean, he is a perfect antidote to the buffoon that is Johnson, because here you have a man he is calm, he has integrity, he has intellect, he's very forensic. It's complete mirror image of Boris Johnson, and that's actually exactly what we need. Obviously, there are issues within the Labour Party and the restructuring of the Labour Party, which he'll need time to do. But we don't know what's going to happen with COVID. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave, or if there is, how prolonged that will be. So I would say from my point of view, he's got a few months now, but think about hitting the ground running next spring, summer 2021, with real policies and, thinking about how do we make long-lasting policies that create change that's fair for everybody.
That makes sense. And of course, Brexit has happened. You fought an historic battle to maintain the integrity of democracy, for which everyone's grateful to you. But what do you think the next real challenge is to our democratic way of life? Because it seems as though the integrity is being undermined now that we have unfettered advisors running their own press conferences in the Rose Garden, the absurdity of what we're seeing with Johnson being controlled by external forces. That seems to be a real danger to democracy to me. What's your sense of that?
I'm very, very worried about our democracy and our constitution, because this 80-seat majority that the Conservatives have and the powers they got if you look at the Coronavirus Act in conjunction with the Withdrawal Act, those two together have given them greater powers than we've seen in the executive for decades. And under the guise of the pandemic and Brexit, they're changing the way our democracy works. So for example, it's my understanding that last November, most of the SPADs employment contracts changed, and that there is a clause in there where Cummings can sack them for behavior he deems to be against the government. So you've got an unelected advisor now being able to sack SPADs. That's completely unbelievable. You've also then got the fact that they're politicizing the appointment of our head of advisors, senior advisor on security. But they're also talking about politicizing the appointment of judges, the fact that there will be a panel with possibly Cummings, Boris, we don't know who, sitting on, where they'll be able to vet judges to find out their views. This is complete and utter nonsense. This will completely decay our democracy, to politicize the judges, to politicize advisors, to politicize the Treasury, to politicize, the joining of DFID with the Foreign Office. So therefore, all trade deals in the future will be based on a political basis. It's not just about what's good for trade. It's also, well, how do we use trade to leverage our politics and what the relationships we want to have? And, it's going to be a bargaining chip, basically, trade deals. It's not going to be just about what's good for our country. Then all of these things, in my view, damage democracy. And then finally, on top of that, you've got vote leave, all those people who use technology to usurp our democracy, sitting in places of power.
It's quite extraordinary. I agree with you. And what kind of a Brexit are we going to finally see, do you think, as we sit here and wait for the final axe to drop? I mean, we're out of the European Union technically, and the transition period is coming to an end. Do you foresee any possibility of any kind of agreement being reached by the European Union and this government?
I can go from my experience of fighting the prorogation case, so Miller 2 case, when I was working with two whistleblowers in number 10. The reason it was so important we brought that case is because we were led to believe that they were going to prorogue Parliament, but then extend it past the 31st of October, and we were going to leave with no deal, which is why the government weren't particularly bothered about the Benn Act. So because of the individuals we were working with and what we uncovered and the evidence, I have always been convinced that no deal is the outcome that they've been looking for, because then they can change the UK to the sort of country they want it to be. those, as I mean, the money people in particular, not just the advisors and the politicians, but the money behind this Conservative Party, have a particular agenda when it comes to business, to employment, to education, to security. They have an ideology, and I've always been convinced that that's where they go. Now that COVID has hit, things have changed slightly. So I think where we possibly will end up is with a very broad overarching agreement, where underneath that we have more sectorial treading water until we figure out what happens next, because that has got to be in the best interest of all parties. And I think that only came about through the necessity of this pandemic.
And finally, if you think about young people and their futures now, and you start to look down the next 5 years, kids who are at secondary school now, they're thinking about their career, they're coming back after the pandemic, they're thinking about their future. And how important is it that the Labour Party gets policies right for them?
My view is that Labour has got to be bold enough to think about changing our further educational system, because it's not fit for professions of the future. So just to give you an example, you know, now the big hot topic is ESG. Everyone's talking about environmental, ethical investing. Okay, the thing that's wrong with that is we don't have any independent auditing of companies. So if that's a solution, and I suggest it is a solution that you have independent auditing, then we have a different type of accounting practice. You know, accounting is going to have to be taught in a very different way than it's been taught to date. We're going to have to, people studying accountancy are going to have to start learning about the environment, about sustainability, about governance. And that's just in one area. If we look at the legal profession, if that's going to go towards more digitization, then you have to have people who understand how technology works. You know, the careers are changing at such a pace that the education behind the individuals going to those professions and jobs has also got to change. So, you know, let's look again at technical colleges. Let's look again at lifelong learning. Let's look at, you know, somebody might end up changing their career 2 or 3 times in their adult life. So that access to a career change, not just lifelong learning, is so important. So I think there is a place for real policy change in university and further education.
And one final point I just wanted to raise with you is, tell us a little bit about Messages of Love, your most recent initiative, because I think let's leave this discussion on a particularly good up note. Tell us a little about that. Oh,
yes. I mean, so when I saw, it was a little boy called Ismail, who was 13 years old, who died from COVID. And his parents, he went off in an ambulance and his parents never saw him again. And that was a story that was happening all the time. And I thought, if people had an opportunity with that mobile phone, it's such an extraordinary device in their hands, if at the bedside or they start ill, they could record a message to their loved ones, to their daughters, to their husbands, to their wives. But you don't want to just send it or have it on the phone, but you might want to deposit it in somewhere safe, just in case. But you might also want to put, you know, letters to your children, your will, whatever it is. So we created a platform with free, because I think it's only fair that I offer this, you know, everyone should have access to it. So a free digital memory box where you can deposit whatever you want to, just in case. And people can have something, a memory, they can have something they can live on, they could relieve some of that guilt of not getting to say goodbye. So Messages of Love was to do that, but it was also because I wanted, you know me, I'll always campaign for something, but it was also using it to try and say, this is a perfect opportunity for us to look at reforming will legislation, because, you know, we're still operating with an act that was written in 1837. You know, modern thinking, modern couples, people sharing, we need to have much more modern use of technology when it comes to will making. So hopefully it's to make people's lives a little less traumatic in these traumatic times.
Gina Miller, thank you very much for being my guest today. It's been great to see you.